Shalom from Jerusalem to everybody. I am Professor Efraim Inbar, the president of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security. And I welcome all to the conference on US and Israel relations, which is co-organized by Bnai Brith International and JISS. We've been for long partners with Bnai Brith, and I'm happy to have another event together. It's my pleasure now to call upon Dan Mariaschin, the CEO of Bnai Brith, to deliver greetings.
Thank you, Efraim. Bnai Brith is pleased to join JISS in this important program focusing on US-Israel relations. We have partnered on several previous programs, as you said, Efraim, and have actually been discussing today's session for many months in anticipation of a year-end webinar in advance of the new political year. As an organization founded in the United States in 1843 during the presidency of John Tyler, we have seen many changes pass before us over the past 177 years, but none has been so meaningful as the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 and its relationship with its most important ally and friend, the United States. Indeed, Bnai Brith played a vital role in cementing US-Israel ties when three leaders of our organization, together with Harry Truman's close friend and former business partner, Eddie Jacobson, were able to arrange a face-to-face meeting in the White House between President Harry Truman and Chaim Weizmann. It was not easy, given the resistance in Truman's circle of advisors to doing the deed and recognizing the Jewish state, but he did, and the rest, as they say, is history. For all of us, 2020 has been a year focused on the coronavirus pandemic and on keeping ourselves, our families, and our colleagues safe and healthy. The availability of vaccines only in the past number of days gives us cause for optimism as we welcome in the new year. But 2020 was not a lost year in terms of events and developments in the political and public policy realms, where many of us have a focused interest. In September, the signing on the White House South Lawn of the Abraham Accords signaled a new era in Israel's relations with its Arab neighbors. Normalization has become the new watchword, as the UAE and Bahrain, along with Sudan, have signed agreements with Israel with the hope and the promise that others will soon follow. And like clockwork, every 4 years, the United States held its presidential election last month. This one enmeshed in questions of widely differing worldviews, ideology, and personal chemistry. The political landscape in the United States is as divided as I've ever seen, and I include in that the torturous period of the Vietnam War and its aftermath. Again, though the world watched as our political season ran through primaries, campaigns, and the actual vote, international crises did not take a sabbatical either. The situation in Syria, Hezbollah's lock on Lebanon, and popular unrest in that country, the ongoing strife in Yemen, the uneasiness of the political situation in Iraq, the Libya question, fought out daily through a proxy war, and the issue of stability in the Eastern Mediterranean have all commanded our attention over the past 12 months, with all of this being constantly under the cloud of Iran, its nuclear intentions, and its malign behavior in the region and beyond. So with our presidential election now behind us, it is vitally important early on to take stock of US-Israel relations over the past 4 years and to prognosticate where events will move that relationship in the months and years to come. Already, a new conventional wisdom is taking hold that some of the changes that have taken place in the region mitigate against simply turning the clock back. New threats, new challenges, and new opportunities present themselves, and new thinking will of necessity be required. So we're pleased that we'll be joined today by experts who have had real-time experience in dealing with and working through these issues and who follow these events under an analytical microscope every day. Thanks, as always, to Efraim Inbar and Eran Lerman for their collegiality and their cooperation for making today's program happen.
Thank you, Dan. We are supposed to be joined by Professor Lieber. For some reason, He's not in yet, so we'll start with Ambassador Dan Shapiro. He is well known for being the ambassador to Israel during the Obama administration. It was not an easy time, and I interacted with him in the past, and I always complimented him for doing a difficult job and doing it so well. He previously served as Senior Director for Middle East and North Africa on the National Security Council, American National Security Council. He also served in numerous senior advisory positions in the US Congress. Nowadays, he is here in Israel since 2017. He is a Distinguished Visiting Fellow at Tel Aviv Institute of National Security Studies. And he will speak to us about anticipating the Biden presidency. Dan, it's your floor.
Thank you, Efraim. It's good to be with you and your colleagues at the Jerusalem International Institute of Security Studies. Good to be with Dan Mariaschin and representatives of Bnai Brith, and with all the audience, and with a distinguished group of fellow panelists. So thanks for the opportunity. So I'll start simply by stating what the overall caveat for any remarks I make about anticipating the Biden presidency is that I have no official role in the transition, and I'm not speaking for anyone but myself, and I'm speaking as an analyst currently in my role at INSS. But I do try to draw on my knowledge of what was said in the campaign, of what I anticipate a Biden administration will try to do in the region to help Israelis and help others anticipate what that policy might look like. And the first thing I think should be laid out is a little bit of the overall context in which that administration will be operating. The first priorities of that administration were very clear when the transition website was unveiled a few days after the election and after the certification, or the election was called by most of the major media news outlets. And it had 4 preloaded issue pages on the transition website. More have been added since, but the ones that were preloaded and ready to go on day one were about COVID recovery, naturally, about recovery from the economic crisis that the United States is currently undergoing, dealing with the crisis of systemic racism and racial injustice that was exemplified during the protests last summer following the murder of George Floyd, and climate change. That tells you something about what the administration's focus will be. All of those have some nexus to foreign policy. There's obviously going to be international cooperation required to distribute the vaccines and to prevent a future pandemic. Trade will be an element of economic recovery. Strengthening democratic institutions in the United States is connected with the overall effort to support democracies against the challenge of autocracies overseas. And of course, the Paris Climate Accords will be re-signed on day one. So there's a very important element of international cooperation on climate change. But just as an indicator of where the administration's early focus will be and how they think they'll be judged by the American people, I think that's important to take note of. Of course, it doesn't mean foreign policy will be ignored. So let's dig in a little bit to the foreign policy priorities of this incoming administration and where the Middle East sits in those broader foreign policy priorities. I think if you look at what that administration, what that campaign spoke about and what that administration will face, you probably would put the top priorities as the following. First of all, revitalizing the key traditional American alliances, particularly in NATO and in Asia, that have been significantly strained during the Trump years. Second would be restoring US leadership in multilateral arenas like the United Nations, like the World Health Organization, like the Paris Accords, and on the major transnational challenges that don't fit into the neat borders of the globe. Climate change, COVID, migration, non-proliferation, the democratic recession. Those are all, I think, areas of badly in need of US leadership of multilateral efforts to address them. Third would be dealing with the challenge of a strategic rivalry with China. that really spans the globe and takes on economic and security and military and technology dimensions, of course. It has a relationship to the Middle East and other regions, but it is thought of first and foremost as a US-China rivalry. And fourth would be dealing with an aggressive Russia that is pressing its advantages, whether they be its relationships or the countries on its borders, or its cyber capabilities, or its ability to pressure European governments and others with energy sources. So those are probably the first foreign policy issues that I would put on the table. Now, generally speaking, the Middle East has trouble breaking into that top tier, and that comes also against the background of a generally expressed desire that was consistent, frankly, and although expressed in different ways in the Obama and the Trump administrations, to avoid the United States being pulled into new major commitments in the Middle East. Iran probably rates an exception in terms of a Middle East issue that can push into the top tier, both because of the inherent dangers of Iran going nuclear, that is to say, the risk of war or the risk of a nuclear arms race in the Middle East, and because it touches on some of those other priorities that I mentioned of US leadership in multilateral arenas and trying to find ways to cooperate with China and Russia, even as we have rivalries with them and the like. But again, for context about what will be on the top of the priority list of a Biden administration's foreign policy, I think that is important background. But now let's dig into a little bit more about the Middle East policy issues that our audience and JISS and Bnai Brith are often so focused on. And here I'd say I see a spectrum of areas in which I see relatively little change, or certainly not dramatic change in a Biden administration approach, and stretching to areas where there will be more significant change from how the Trump administration has approached them. The first of these, where there's, I think, the least change, has to do with the bilateral US-Israel relationship. Everybody knows, and Efraim, you mentioned it earlier, how people in Israel feel they know Joe Biden. They've seen him run repeated visits over many decades. They know his commitment and even the emotion with which he has expressed it toward Israel, toward its security, toward its legitimacy, towards the US-Israel partnership. And I think you just can't expect anything other than a president and an administration that will be deeply committed to all of those principles. He brings out of the Obama years the significantly deepened US-Israel security cooperation, from intelligence training, intelligence sharing, to joint training, to technology areas like Iron Dome and tunnel detection and other missile defense, to the $38 billion MOU. And I see every reason for him to pick up on the advancements made on those during the Trump years and continue to advance them. He is deeply committed to protecting Israel's legitimacy anywhere it is challenged, whether that's in the United Nations or by Palestinians or by the BDS movement at home. He's deeply committed to defending Israel's right to defend itself, whether that's in Gaza or Syria or Lebanon or anywhere threats emanate from. And I think this somewhat answers the question that I often get about, well, where does a Biden administration sit, or President Biden sit, with respect to the debate within the Democratic Party on the US-Israel partnership? I think that it more or less answers that question. The fact that he became the nominee, the fact that he won with strong support, and really those commitments were never challenged. I don't expect them to be challenged in his administration. So that's the first area. Second area, and we're moving down the spectrum where there may be some difference, but here relatively less difference, has to do with a Biden administration, I believe, recognizing the huge opportunity that the normalization agreements, the Abraham Accords, presents in the Middle East, to US interests, to Israel's interests, to the interests of other friends and partners in the region, and to regional stability. So I would expect a Biden administration to, he's already declared, it was actually one of the few Trump foreign policy achievements that you can say during the campaign, now President-elect Biden warmly welcomed, had only positive things to say about. He said, this is consistent with longstanding US bipartisan support for Israel's normalization, something he had worked on himself as senator and as a vice president. Something he intends to try to continue and even challenge other nations to keep pace with the first countries that had joined the Abraham Accords, and that he intends to work on that. I'll get to what's slightly different in just a moment. So I would expect the Biden administration to look for ways to expand on these agreements, to build on them, to take advantage of that new dynamic in the region. It's a clear opportunity. It's the opportunity to advance something that he believes is the right thing. Recognizing Israel simply on its own merits is the right thing to do, and something that Arab states long ago should have done. It's certainly better for the United States when U.S. partners in the region collaborate with one another. And there had already been quiet security cooperation between them, but now that can be done openly with intelligence sharing and with joint training of militaries and with technology. That's a very welcome change. And clearly, as we've seen already in the early weeks and months of the Israel-UAE and Israel-Bahrain relationships, there are economic and technology and trade and tourism and people-to-people and cultural and academic and medical exchanges underway that will obviously bring benefit to both countries and both peoples, bring benefit to the region as a whole, and are so different from the cold peace model that the Egyptian and Jordanian peace agreements have defined over the previous quarter century and 40 years, respectively. So it's also important because to a significant degree, it's helpful for Iran to see that regional dynamic emerging. Iran, the common adversary of all of these countries, it certainly creates fewer opportunities for it to sow divisions among its regional rivals as those countries normalize and deepen their relations with Israel. And it creates possibilities for the United States to position its regional security role as one of supporting its collaborating partners, not necessarily as the overall leader of that effort. Again, consistent with, I think, a deeply held sense of the American public that we want to avoid having to be always the leader in at least in an active battlefield way on Middle East security. Now, at the same time, there are some challenges that come with this. Of course, everyone is looking at other countries who may join, and some may even join before the Biden administration takes office. The one, of course, is the big one from a strategic and cultural and religious point of view would be the Saudi Arabia normalization, if and when that comes. That's something that the Biden administration, I believe, will actively try to pursue, but it may do it differently from the Trump administration style. People have focused on the question of the F-35 deal for the UAE and whether that means the Saudis will be anticipating they would get something similar, or the Western Sahara recognition for Morocco. A Biden administration certainly will pursue normalization, but may choose, again, I'm not privy to specific decisions, certainly may choose to review previous decisions, but I think more importantly, may choose a different approach to how to encourage those Arab states to do what is the right thing and in their own interest, but maybe doesn't necessarily merit the same kind of quid pro quo as some of those agreements seem to have been structured. So it's also going to run concurrently with a separately stated commitment by the Biden administration to do a reassessment of the U.S.-Saudi relationship in light of Saudi Arabia's regional role that has not always been consistent with U.S. interests in Yemen, in Qatar, in Lebanon, and other places, in light of the treatment of women and other human rights activists in Saudi Arabia. So there are possibilities and opportunities here, but they obviously also run against some challenges, and it may look different from the Trump administration's approach to trying to achieve the same goal. Third, as I move down the spectrum of where we may see more difference, and this would be on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. Now, here I make a distinction because I don't really see, as I've understood the Trump administration's approach, although I'm happy to be corrected if others feel differently, challenged, I should say, if others feel differently, has not really been committed to the traditional model of a two-state solution that previous U.S. administrations, from Clinton to Bush to Obama, believed in. That's not really what is described in the Trump peace plan presented in January of this year. And so I believe we would be very likely to see a Biden administration reassert a U.S. commitment to a more traditional model of that two-state solution as the strategic goal, the strategic objective of U.S. policy in this area. Not something that can be achieved immediately. In fact, maybe not something that one should even try to bring the parties to negotiate in the short term, but certainly as a guide star, as a strategic objective that would keep Israel Jewish and democratic and secure, very important U.S. interest because it's so fundamental to the values-based security partnership that we have with Israel. Also meeting Palestinians' legitimate rights for independence in a state of their own, and at least to work to keep that goal alive. If it's not possible now with current leaders or based on current conditions, at least work to keep that alive. Some of the early steps in that regard were laid out in the campaign, restoring some of the U.S. assistance that had been cut off, that permitted under U.S. law to Palestinian people, Palestinian economic development, humanitarian aid, hospitals, security cooperation between Israel and the Palestinians, all areas that the Trump administration eliminated despite being totally permissible under U.S. law, even the Taylor Force Act. Certainly urging both Israel and Palestinians not to take the unilateral measures, whether that's delegitimization or going to UN organizations on the Palestinian side, or paying salaries to terrorists, or settlement expansion and talk of annexation on the Israeli side, any of those things that would make it harder ultimately to achieve a two-state solution. And also encouraging both sides to do those things which can do the opposite, actually increase the possibility by strengthening the Palestinian institutions, the Palestinian economy, the security cooperation, the areas in which a Palestinian Authority can operate, and the like. And I would expect the administration to approach both sides as a supporter and as a friend, but also be willing to make tough asks of both of them. Certainly, a Biden administration will want to have a normalized or a diplomatic relationship of any kind with the Palestinian Authority, which currently is lacking. There's no consulate in Jerusalem, there's no PLO office in Washington, and there's no diplomatic dialogue whatsoever between Israel, between the United States and the Palestinian Authority. So that's an area I believe they would address. And here again, I believe that the Biden administration would say, and it links back to the previous item on the list, that the normalization of Israel's relations with Arab states actually can be a source of positive momentum on the Israeli-Palestinian track as well, toward a two-state solution, not toward pushing the Palestinian issue to the side and making it irrelevant, which has some people's reaction. Some Palestinians reacted very negatively initially to normalization, saying they'd been abandoned and their issue was off the table. Some Israelis reacted triumphantly and said, now the issue is off the table and we don't have to worry about it anymore. I think a Biden administration is very likely to say, look, Arab states that have a normalized dialogue with the Israeli public and the Israeli government are going to have a very different kind of conversation with Israel, and perhaps a different kind of influence with Israel on its approach to the future of the Israeli-Palestinian relationship. Arab states that are willing to provide significant support to Palestinian institutional development, and some of these countries have the resources to do that, and also some positive pressure on Palestinians about how they are going to have to adjust their curriculum, their narrative, their political positions in negotiations, can actually be major contributors to giving a two-state solution more life and more possibility for the future. There are other more strategic judgments on how that policy would unfold that I don't think would be made until much later. Those ones I mentioned are sort of in the early phase. But the questions of what to say about when and how, or whether to even try to restart negotiations, I think that's a much later term decision. When do you want to move from just trying to keep a two-state solution alive to actually trying to advance and achieve it? That comes later. Whether to put a U.S. plan on the table as a guide to negotiations or as a substitute when there can be no negotiations, and how to do any of these things in a way that doesn't discourage additional Arab states from moving forward on normalization, and then preparing for a Palestinian leadership transition, which is clearly in the offing. It's even already beginning to play out, and how that will affect opportunities in this domain. So that's the third area. And the last area I'll just touch on, and I won't have enough time to touch on it in as much detail as it requires, but that's Iran. And that's obviously where we will see some significant difference in the Biden administration's approach from the Trump administration approach. Now, nobody who, neither President-elect Biden or anybody who works for him has any illusions about the nature of the Iranian regime, about its malign intentions toward Israel, toward our other partners in the region, toward US forces, its interests and desire to achieve nuclear weapons, its support for terrorism, or the dangers that any of those things pose. So I fully expect that will be a very important context for how a Biden administration tries to achieve its objectives. Now, what the Biden campaign said was that it was prepared in the first phase to rejoin the JCPOA in the context of mutual compliance. And it started from the position that, look, however, whatever one thinks of the JCPOA, there are a couple of facts that are very relevant. One is that Iran today is much, much closer to a nuclear weapon than it was while the JCPOA was in force. After the Trump administration withdrew in 2018, Iran began to violate its commitments. It's now got 12 times the enriched uranium it's permitted. It's at basically by Israeli and US and other intelligence estimates in the 2 to 3 or 4 month period of breakout rather than the year that the deal permitted. So that's a simple fact that one has to reckon with. The second is that the US, in the course of pursuing this policy, definitely found itself in greater agreement with certain regional partners, but also found itself significantly isolated from other partners and others internationally, our European allies and Russia and China, to the point where the US was extremely ineffective, while effective at imposing its own unilateral sanctions under the maximum pressure policy, very ineffective in getting others to participate, extending the UN arms embargo, triggering the snapback, and the like. So one of the things that I think that a Biden administration is going to try to do is return the United States to a point, a position of international leadership that will bring others along on the U.S. approach. Now, declaring a willingness to return to the JCPOA, again, in the framework of mutual compliance, is only a first step. First of all, it may never be relevant. If Iran is never able, and they're so far out of compliance now, I think it's a significant question whether they will find their way back into compliance. So it may never be actually tested. And simply the declaration provides the United States with some of the goodwill with Europeans and others that the Biden administration would be seeking to change that dynamic and shift a lot of the pressure onto Iran. In addition, even if this is pursued, and of course it does require the removal of some of the Trump sanctions, one of the things that we have all learned from the Trump sanctions is that unilateral US sanctions policy actually can have some very significant impact on Iran's economy. And so that leverage remains as a tool to be applied if the situation required it. But regardless of whether or not a Biden administration would return to the JCPOA, I think it was always clear that was just a preliminary step, that was never considered the end of nuclear diplomacy with Iran, but rather the beginning. And what he has talked about throughout the campaign is that the real strategic objective needs to be a much longer term, much broader in terms of the technologies it applies to, including ballistic missiles, and also including Iran's regional malign role, and much stronger in terms of the restrictions and inspections kind of agreement that will ensure Iran never comes close to a nuclear weapon and keeps all the options available to the United States to ensure that's the case. But that the way to actually achieve that agreement and have the U.S. have the legitimacy to act alone if it becomes necessary is to restore the broad international support. So going back through the JCPOA is one pathway toward that strategic objective, but that's not the only pathway. You may go around the JCPOA, or you may ignore it, or you may do a JCPOA minus or a freeze for freeze. There are all kinds of possibilities to add time on the clock to really not focus on that question, which is a preliminary question, and really focus on the longer term strategic objective. And that obviously is going to require very close consultations with Israel, very close consultations with other regional partners. That's a crucial element of the approach. I've heard over the last few days and a couple of weeks, a number of Israeli and Gulf officials say, talk to your regional partners, talk to your regional partners. I think it's unthinkable that a Biden administration would undertake any policy area in this phase without talking to the regional partners. It can't do that during the transition. That's not possible, but it can as of January 21st. And if those countries are prepared to have that kind of dialogue, which should be a professional, discreet dialogue, not something that plays out in the press on a daily basis, I actually think it can be very productive. His commitment, President-elect Biden's commitment, Israel's security and its ability to defend itself is really not in question. Many of the capabilities Israel does use to address the Iranian threat in Syria, and that Israel would use if it ever needed to strike Iran, it has, because of decisions that were reached while President-elect Biden was vice president and had his strong support and input. And so that dialogue cannot be undertaken. And I'll just close with this thought. While that disagreement, which we've heard playing out in some of these statements over the last few weeks, may focus on that shorter term preliminary step question about the JCPOA, on the longer term strategic objective of that longer, broader, stronger deal, I believe there's an enormous amount of convergence between US and Israeli and Gulf Arab and European positions. And in fact, there should be an opportunity for a great deal of cooperative consultative work toward that objective, even if there are disagreements about some of the tactical steps along the way. So I'm going to stop there. My dog is barking, and I'll take a breath, let others speak, and happy to contribute to the discussion later.
Thank you, Dan. We'll now move on to Professor Lieber, who joined us, an old friend of mine. He is Emeritus Professor of Government at Georgetown University. He serves there as chair of the government department. He's author of and editor of 17 books on international relations and American foreign policy. He's going to finish a new book on the indispensable nation, American foreign policy in a turbulent world. And also he has served as advisor to several presidential campaigns, to the State Department, and to the drafter of the US intelligence estimates. And Bob, you are invited to talk about the meaning of 2020 American elections.
Efraim, thank you very much. And on behalf of Zoom technology, which is both ubiquitous and wildly imperfect, I apologize for not being on at the start. It had to do with the technology itself.
I'm sure you'll reward us.
Pardon me?
You'll reward us now.
Right. Second, while my talk is about the meaning of the 2020 elections, I want to pick up on one of the last remarks that Ambassador Dan Shapiro made. He talked about the importance and the certainty of close consultation between the Biden administration, Israel, and other Middle Eastern allies on the relations with Iran and whether or not to rejoin the JCPOA. I mention it because there is a stark, almost embarrassing contrast with what the Obama administration did. It conspicuously failed to consult with Israel and others in its negotiations with the Iranians as part of the P5+1. And when it did consult with Israeli and other leaders, it lied to them about what the terms of the agreement would be and what the US was seeking to achieve in the negotiations. However, my task has to do with the 2020 elections, and I will do my best to stay within your 18 to 20 minute time limit. Let me begin. To start, the November election showed the resilience of America's political institutions and its constitutional system. I cite that because it's a comparison with the hysteria of so many critics of America at home and abroad, not just during and immediately after the election, but also over the last 4 or 5 years, many of whom who have invoked fears that America's democracy was imperiled, or that America could be compared with Weimar Germany before the Nazi takeover, or that Trump could be compared with Mussolini. The fact is that Biden won by more than 7 million votes, 81 million versus 74 million, and by a margin of more than 4%, approximately 52% to 48, in a record turnout, the highest proportional turnout in an American election in many, many years. I should add that that election turnout, the repudiation of Donald Trump and the election of Biden, was much more of a rejection of Trump than it was an affirmation of Biden. Many of those who voted for Biden did so without enthusiasm, but because they were determined to rid the United States of the Trump presidency. Went on to claim that the election had been stolen, that there was massive fraud. That complaint is delusional and patently false. It is strikingly the case that all of the courts in the 49 of the 50 states, as well as the Supreme Court, have repeatedly turned down the proposed legal cases by Trump and his supporters, in many cases dismissing them out of hand as simply unreasonable, inappropriate, and with no basis in fact. Also important to note that although Trump presided over the appointment of no fewer than 3 members of the U.S. Supreme Court, getting his nominees past the Republican-controlled Senate, none of the Trump nominees to the Supreme Court supported the Trump administration in its effort to have his case heard by the Supreme Court. That's something about the strength of the judiciary system and of the strength and durability of our institutions and of the judicial system. That Republican state officials in states like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Arizona, where the election results were challenged, that even in those states, officials who dealt with elections there all repudiated the arguments made by Trump. Furthermore, Trump's own Attorney General, William Barr, and the official appointed by Trump originally to be in charge of monitoring the cyber technology of the election, both have rejected these claims of falsification in any way that would have overturned the results of the election. In addition, another point, the election was fought on domestic issues. Exit polls show that the most important issue for American voters as they went to vote on election day or sent in their ballots in advance was the pandemic. The second most important issue was the economy and jobs. After that, all the other issues were in single digits: healthcare, racism, even the climate at 4%. Last, and mentioned by just 1% of voters, was foreign policy. That suggests to me that Biden has some latitude in foreign policy. It's not a priority for him, but it was also not a priority in the election, which gives him some flexibility, provided that other conditions can be met. Biden will take office January 20th, just 1 month from now, and his presidency offers the possibility of reform and renewal at home, a return to normal, one might say, and most importantly, renewed American leadership abroad. There are plenty of tasks and obstacles, but Biden is committed to the necessary American role abroad. He notes that the international community does not organize itself. And for those who want to see a primary source, you can look at the March Foreign Affairs essay this year, written by Biden and presumably by either Jake Sullivan or Tony Blinken, his top foreign policy appointees. Sets out his view of foreign policy. The essay is called Why America Must Lead Again. And in it, he says, I will take immediate steps to renew U.S. democracy and alliances, protect the economic future, and once more, have America lead the world. No other nation has that capacity, unquote. From where I sit, those are very important statements. And I should note that they are totally at variance with the instinctual approach to foreign policy of our two previous presidents. Barack Obama, president for 8 years, took office with a determination to achieve retrenchment in American policy, to pull back from America's engagement, in the belief that it was that engagement abroad that caused our adversaries to be antagonistic to us. And that if America pulled back, reached out its hand to its adversaries, show that we meant them no harm, things would change. That was false. And ultimately, at the very end of the Obama administration, in December 2016, wistfully, Obama, in an interview in Latin America where he was traveling, observed that there really was no substitute for America's world role. No one else, no other country, not the UN, not the EU, no one else could play the kind of role the US does, which was absolutely vital. As for Donald Trump, his view was much too transactional. He failed to show that he appreciated the importance of alliances, of the US role in resolving collective action dilemmas, and of the importance of American values and soft power in underpinning America's world role and as a source of great power for it. Joe Biden's top foreign policy appointees are people who have written and spoken in ways that reflect exactly what Biden is talking about. They have both worked closely with Biden over the years. They are his nominee for Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, and Jake Sullivan, his nominee as National Security Advisor. One can also add Biden's Chief of Staff in the White House, Ron Klain. The three of them are deeply experienced, are close to Biden, and share his outlook. In foreign policy, this will not be a team of rivals, as it was, for example, under Obama, nor will it be a team with a revolving door, as was constantly the case under Trump, where one after another, Trump officials in foreign and domestic policies were constantly walking out the door or being thrown out the door by a president who showed no willingness or ability to be briefed, to read, to think hard and long and clear about foreign and domestic policy. Now, it's also important that Biden and those with him see a need to counter the rising revisionist powers, Russia, China, and Iran. Although in appointing his cabinet outside the realm of foreign policy, Biden has also been less effective in that he has been mindful of making appointments based on identity, gender, race, ethnicity, and so forth. America is a huge pluralistic country. Some of that is important. When you look, for example, at his appointment to be Secretary of Defense, instead of appointing Michelle Flournoy, who is arguably the single most talented and appropriate and capable person to fill that role, with deep experience and sound judgment, instead of appointing her, as seemed likely, he has at this point appointed a former general to fill that role, an African American who's capable but doesn't have the breadth and experience nor the kind of leadership role in the Defense Department that Flournoy had in a second or third ranked position in the past. Biden has also been criticized from both the left and the right for either doing too much or not enough to satisfy the claims of different ethnic groups. The main point, however, is that Biden's presidency in both foreign and domestic policy represents a sea change from his two predecessors, one to be very much welcome. I should add that Middle East policy will not be a replay of Obama, but nor will it be a priority for Biden for some of the reasons that Dan Shapiro mentioned. But foreign policy is not Biden's priority. Domestic policy is. The first priority is grappling with ending the pandemic. The second priority, the economy and economic recovery from the pandemic. On top of that, climate and racial justice. Only then does foreign policy figure in that hierarchy. I will say about Israel, while there are some differences with Obama, the most important difference is that both he and his Vice President Peres are pro-Israel in their kishkis, which when crises come or differences arise, remains very important. It was not the case with Obama, but I think it is the case now. I also, contrary to Dan Shapiro, don't think he will follow the failed efforts by the Clinton, Bush, and Obama administrations, expended prodigious amounts of time and political capital in trying to negotiate a solution between Israel and the Palestinians. While he would almost certainly devoutly wish that's the case, I don't think he or his administration, in view of the failures of those presidencies, and because the situation is not right, especially due to the problem among the Palestinians themselves. They are both unwilling and unable to enter into that kind of agreement at this time, that I don't think it's going to be a priority for them the way it was under Obama and the others. As has been noted, Biden wants to return to the JCPOA, but with improved terms. The likelihood he can achieve that, I think, is doubtful given the Iranians themselves, but at least he has the benefit of the leverage provided by the Trump sanctions, which could help him in trying to squeeze the Iranians to agree to some of the important changes in the agreement as return to it. Biden is also identified with opposition to endless wars. That was a theme of his two predecessors, but there's no reason to think he would embrace arbitrary withdrawal from longstanding commitments and abandonment of allies, as both Obama and Trump did. He's likely to want to maintain a strong military as a deterrent to threats and a mainstay of alliances. And when it comes to engagements in the wider Middle East, I think there's an understanding that while the U.S. is very unlikely to commit significant combat troops to any of the areas where it's present or could be present, the use of America's comparative advantage, its special forces, its air power, its technology, its drones, its ability to train and coordinate and provide intelligence and surveillance will continue to be made available in ways that are extremely important. I've referred to Biden's domestic priorities. I've already said a bit about foreign policy. So what could go wrong? Well, here I'm fond of quoting a now famous remark made by former British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan when he took over as Prime Minister in 1957. He was asked by a journalist what could derail, what could push off course the agenda of his incoming government. His reply was briefly, events, dear boy, events. Well, if you look at the last 20 years, unexpected events, what political economists like to refer to as black swans, have pushed America's policy and presidencies off course repeatedly. They include the 9/11 terrorist attacks in the year 2001, wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the economic shocks, unprecedented economic shocks, 2008, 2009, and now in conjunction with the pandemic, the Arab Spring of 2011, the rise of ISIS, the deadliest pandemic in world and American history in 100 years, and a domestic cultural revolution around the issue of race. Domestic politics is a sharply divided country, which creates difficulties for successful policy making. The frequent result is divided government. We don't have a parliamentary system, so that it's not unusual to have a president of one party and at least one house of the Congress in the hands of the opposition. In the case of Biden, depending on the outcome of 2 runoff elections in Georgia in early January, it's likely that the Senate will remain in Republican hands, which means that in getting legislation passed, Biden will not have a hand. Actually, this may not be a bad thing. It allows him to counter the pressures from his hard left, the so-called young progressives, who are pushing an agenda which is very unpopular to the American public as a whole, and which is unpopular and unworkable in foreign policy. If the Republicans control the Senate, Biden will be able to say, look, I love you like a brother. I would like to do it, but I can't get it past the Senate, so we can only do what's possible. I think that would be helpful to him. It's also worth noting that while Trump lost the election, he was soundly repudiated despite his claims, which are, as I say, delusional, and his advocates are involved in what's sometimes referred to as tinfoil hat stuff with a complete departure from reality. It's worth noting that the Republican Party did better than Trump did. Whereas Trump lost, the Republicans in the House of Representatives gained something between 10 and 12 seats in the Congress, House of Representatives, whereas they were expected to lose that many seats. The Senate, they lost only 1 and look like they will have retained control. I should add that important parts of the Obama, I write about this stuff, of the Biden foreign policy agenda are acceptable and can even be embraced by the mainstream of Republicans in the Senate. Pushing back against and responding to the challenges posed by China, Russia, and Iran would have broadly, I think, have support among mainstream Republicans. Also, support for Israel, broadly speaking, has very strong support among congressional and Senate Republicans. Biden wants to start out with a fresh agenda, get cooperation across the parties and with the broader public. But he risks making the mistake that Obama did. Obama used to say on the one hand, yes, he wants bipartisan cooperation. In the next sentence, he would describe the opposition, describe the Republicans in the most pejorative terms. Unfortunately, the other day, a Biden spokesman referring to the Republicans used the F word to describe them, something that congressional leaders were not amused by. And unless Biden's people get the clear signal that they're supposed to cooperate, not use swear words to describe their opposition, it's not going to be so easy to gain cooperation. Let me wrap up. The Biden presidency represents a new beginning for the United States, domestic and foreign policy, and for renewed American leadership. But there are considerable obstacles to it at home and abroad, even if there are not more unexpected events to derail the administration. It's a tougher foreign policy arena with Russia and China, much harder, much tougher opponents. The domestic political situation is more fragmented and more difficult, but the impact of the election does give Biden something of a mandate. I think in foreign policy, if Biden is effective in what he wants, the leadership will be more selective, less far-ranging than in the past. But the fact is the U.S. possesses the wealth, the resources, the resilient institutions, and the willing partners to act accordingly. So one would hope that the meaning of this election is that America is back. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Bob. We'll move now to Lahav Harkov. Can we see your face, Lahav? Hello, are you with us?
Yes. Hi, yes, I've been here the whole time.
Okay, good. It's my pleasure to introduce Lahav Harkov. She's senior contributor editor at the Jerusalem Post. She is a diplomatic correspondent of the newspaper. She interviewed all major figures along the political spectrum in Israel. And she's well connected to country's top lawmakers. And of course, she is of American origin, and she's very much interested in American politics. And she'll talk about the new Congress in Israel. Lahav, your floor.
Yeah, thank you so much for that introduction. So I'm here to talk a little bit about Congress and the results of the election in Congress, as opposed to just the presidential race. But I will open by addressing the presidential race a little bit. And I guess something that Ambassador Shapiro had already mentioned, but I think it's important to note that the Democratic primaries, both for president and for Congress, showed a certain direction. I think especially in the presidency, the fact that Biden won, and he is a relative moderate, perhaps in his youth, in his earlier years in politics, he was considered maybe more of a progressive, but certainly in recent decades, he's considered sort of middle of the road, a moderate Democrat. And the fact that he won the primary as opposed to Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, or even candidates that were considered more moderate to some extent, like Pete Buttigieg. When it comes to Israel, Biden was more moderate than any of them because they had all discussed making aid to Israel, American aid to Israel, conditional on certain behaviors by Israel, especially ending Israel's presence in Judea and Samaria in the West Bank. Biden, despite Biden says he opposes that. He said it shortly around the same time that the other candidates had said at J Street that they think that these things should be conditional on each other. In May, I believe it was, Israel's Channel 13 reported on diplomatic cables from 1973 on Biden's first trip to Israel. I'm confusing two things. They did. And those cables were very interesting. And at that time, Biden did speak out against settlement activity. But it was later in the 1980s. Got a little confused for me. It was later in the 1980s, and this was something that was widely reported even at the time, when then Prime Minister Menachem Begin was in Washington and he visited Congress, that Biden actually did threaten Begin the way Buttigieg, Warren, and Sanders were calling to do. Now, that shows, I think, the way things have changed, maybe to some extent in the U.S.-Israel relationship. I think in some ways it's showed how Biden has changed. He certainly has considered himself to be pro-Israel all along, and he said many pro-Israel things, but clearly what that means to him changed over time. But at this point, I think it's at a point where he's considered really, truly moderate, and he is the leader of the party. He won. And even when you look at certain pockets of the party and certain districts that have moved very strongly to the left, it's clear that overall people are looking for someone who isn't going to pull the party too far to the left. Now, when we look, district by district, I can't say that I have analyzed, the many hundreds, but when we look, first of all, all eyes these days are on Georgia and the race in Georgia. And the reason for that is because, well, Democrats won the House of Representatives by a smaller margin than they did 2 years ago, which surprised a lot of people. I think that there was an expectation, certainly among Democrats, to some extent, that there was going to be a blue wave, that you know, Trump will be defeated so decisively, and that will sort of trickle down to the elections in Congress. And that didn't happen as much, or at least not nearly as much as people expected. But the Democrats maintained a majority in the House of Representatives, even though it's narrower. In the Senate, it is now coming down to Georgia, I'm sure, I'm sure many of you know. And there are 2 special races in Georgia. So I'm going to just zoom in a little bit on Georgia before we talk sort of more broadly about progressives and what that means for Israel, because I think that is important where the Senate goes. So, and Israel has become, to some extent, at least for Jewish Americans, has become an issue in the Georgia race. So the Democrats have fielded 2 candidates for Senate. One is John Ossoff, and the other is Reverend Warnock. And Ossoff, I think he's a progressive candidate, but when it comes to Israel, he's fairly mainstream. He's Jewish. He just wrote a letter this week that was published in the Atlanta Jewish Times, talked about, you know, growing up around Holocaust survivors. He has family in Israel. So these are, you know, and his statements on Israel have been pretty mainstream, you know, 2-state solution, things like that. He supports Palestinian human rights, which I think every Democrat will be saying these days. And, you know, so fairly non-controversial, I think, when it comes to Israel. He's pretty typical Democrat. Warnock, on the other hand, has been, he made a speech, I believe it was about 2 years ago. He accused Israel of, you know, just profligately shooting Palestinian children. He signed a letter that compared Israel, it was not to South African apartheid. So he has like plausible deniability because he goes around saying, I didn't say Israel is an apartheid state. It is true, he didn't, but he did compare Israel to South Africa in the apartheid era when it was colonizing Namibia, which I'm not really sure. I mean, you know, it's a difference without a distinction. Like it's a very, and so it's interesting to see what the politics of the Jewish community on this issue. And certainly the Republican Jewish coalition and other figures on the right have come out against Warnock on, you know, these statements, the letter that he signed and the statements that he's made on this issue. But at the same time, 200 rabbis in Georgia signed a letter, you know, defending him and saying that he is an ally. More recently, there's a letter by Orthodox rabbis of major institutions in Atlanta and Savannah asking Warnock to further clarify his position on Israel. And that was today or yesterday. I only read about it today. And so I don't think there's been a response from him yet, but that will be interesting to see going forward. On the Republican side, David Perdue, who's the candidate running against Ossoff, he ran an ad that lengthened Ossoff's nose. And so Ossoff and others have accused it of being an anti-Semitic campaign tactic, you know, sort of to emphasize the Jew with the big nose. They've not apologized for that, but they removed the ad. And then the candidate running against Warnock is Kelly Loeffler. You have to forgive me if I mispronounce some names because I do not watch American cable news. I just read a lot of American news, but I believe it's Loeffler. So she is very, very Trumpy, you know, makes a lot of the kinds of bombastic statements Trump makes, for better or for worse. And she has associated herself with people, you know, who spread the QAnon conspiracy theory. And so she's come under, which is also, depending on which, you know, branch of this conspiracy theory you ascribe to, can also be anti-Semitic. And so those are the concerns on the Republican side. And so this will be an interesting race. I mean, Israel, as far as Israel is concerned, as opposed to anti-Semitism, they'll probably toe the Republican line, which is comfortable for the Israeli government, certainly. But, you know, the anti-Semitism, I think, is an important issue to Jews no matter where they are, or should be, in my opinion. And so it's an interesting race where there's, you know, sort of controversies all around. And I think that Jews in Georgia probably have to, you know, prioritize and decide what's important to them. Now, looking more broadly, you know, the past 2 years, when it comes to Congress and Israel, there's been a lot of focus on the so-called squad of members of Congress who are highly critical of Israel. And there are 4 members of Congress who are basically considered to be the squad, and 3 out of 4 of them are supportive of boycotting Israel, either openly or, you know, they kind of skirt the issue in a way that is, you know, makes it difficult to say that they don't support it. Again, it's a plausible deniability thing, maybe. So the squad in its entirety has been reelected to Congress. And there's another new member of Congress from St. Louis who is also pro-boycotting Israel. So there's that. But there are other progressives that have been elected that are pretty pro-Israel. They're both in New York, and they're both in the Bronx, which is, you know, AOC is also in a district that is the Bronx and Queens. So the Bronx has become like a pretty leading place for progressivism these days. But in any case, one of them, Jamal Bauman, he defeated Elliot Engel in the primary, and, you know, Bauman can't compare to Engel on Israel issues. You know, Engel has for decades been a staunch supporter of Israel and, you know, a leading figure in Congress in foreign policy issues. Bauman is, I don't think, is not really looking to compete with Engel when it comes to Israel. But on the other hand, you know, he has said things that are critical of Israel. Again, he's very progressive. He's pro-Palestinian rights. He's for Palestinian statehood. And you know, has said things critical of Israel, but on the other hand, when there was criticism by a prominent rabbi in the Bronx, who I just blanked out on his name, even though he's a very famous rabbi, so if someone wants to remind me in the notes, it's fine, but of the Riverdale Jewish Center, and I still can't remember his name. But in any case, so when the rabbi sort of came out and criticized him in a local newspaper, Bauman was very sort of defensive of his record on Israel, and has said that he's not anti-Israel, he doesn't support boycotts of Israel. So, you know, that I suppose is promising, even though he is sort of very progressive in the way of the squad, and he in some ways has aligned himself with the squad. Now, there's another candidate in the Bronx named Richie Torres, and he is a really interesting figure to watch. I recommend Googling. There's sort of a short profile of him in Bloomberg recently. I've been trying to interview him, but our schedules have not worked out. So maybe I could tell you to Google it in the Jerusalem Post one day. But in the meantime, he seems like a very interesting figure. He's very pro-Israel, while also being a very progressive figure. He was invited to visit Israel by, I believe it was the Jewish Community Relations Council in New York, and he visited Israel 2015 or 2016, you know, and he came back very impressed by what he saw. And he also came back sort of shocked by how he was demonized by his fellow progressives just for visiting Israel. And he had said that he's not someone who gave Israel a lot of thought. You know, he was a member of New York City Council at the time. It wasn't such a big thing to him. But, you know, he saw it was a democracy. He saw the kind of LGBTQ community Israel has, and that Israel is supportive to those communities and gives them a lot of rights. And so he has actually been a very major pro-Israel voice, despite being a very progressive candidate. And I think he's someone interesting to watch. I mean, he has called these sort of like purity tests that the DSA and other progressive groups have put forward for progressive candidates, that, you know, they shouldn't visit Israel and they should declare fealty to BDS. The word he used was insane. And I have a quote from him. He said, "The progressive position is to promote a Jewish state and a Palestinian state, not to end the existence of Israel as a Jewish state." So I think he's an interesting person to watch. Of course, he's one person out of hundreds. but I do think overwhelmingly the trend in Congress is not moving to the left on Israel so much. I think that, pro-Israel, people who are pro-Israel in the Democratic Party or the Republican Party can rest assured that there's not going to be such a major shift in Congress. Now, there are some issues now on sort of Congress's table that may or may not continue into the Biden administration, having to do with the Abraham Accords. First of all, there are the weapon sales to the UAE. Congress failed to block that. I think that was about 2 weeks ago now. So that sale is moving forward, but it takes time, and in all likelihood, there will continue to be votes and congressional involvement in the Biden, after the Biden administration as well, after the turnover in Congress. I wouldn't be surprised if that would still go through. I think the opposition to it is sort of on very specific lines. On certain lines in the Republican Party, there's a little bit of a, I guess, isolationist branch of the Republican Party, which is bigger than it was before Trump. But again, it's not the sort of mainstream foreign policy position. It's more nuanced than that, right? They're isolationists in the sense that they don't love the UN. They don't love people who don't pay what they're supposed to pay to NATO. But they're not, saying we shouldn't sell weapons to anyone or things like that. That is more of a smaller minority group in the Republican Party. And also, in the Democratic Party, it's more going to be more progressives who will oppose that, even though there are questions regarding their involvement in the civil war in Yemen. But that's somewhat in the past. So I don't think that there will be a huge shift in that way with the UAE issue. There are two other issues, however, and this is the sort of complicated nature of these normalizations with Israel being tied up with other issues between the U.S. and those countries that are establishing relations with Israel. So there's the legal peace issue with Sudan. Sudan wants immunity from future lawsuits regarding past terrorist attacks because Sudan harbored al-Qaeda for several years in the 1990s. And it's actually sort of al-Qaeda got rich in Sudan because they ran all sorts of farms and industry until they were thrown out, including Osama bin Laden himself was thrown out. But so a lot of terrorist attack victims in major attacks by al-Qaeda have sued Sudan. And the U.S. came to an agreement that Sudan had to pay out over $300 million, but that there would be no further lawsuits. Now, this is not yet passed in Congress. And the major obstacle right now is opposition from Senator Schumer from New York and Senator Menendez from New Jersey, who want 9/11 victims. There are a few little issues, but the main thing is that they want 9/11 victims to be able to sue Sudan if they want as well for having harbored Osama bin Laden. The thing with Sudan is, and I had just read an article in I believe it was Wall Street Journal, that got the Sudan story really all wrong. And they made it seem like Sudan was taken off the state sponsors of terror list because of Israel, that America wanted them to normalize so much that America was willing to take them off of the list. And it's not really how that's been going. Sudan, for almost 2 years now, has been undergoing a process of trying to move towards becoming a democracy. They toppled dictator Omar al-Bashir, and they want to become a democracy. They have a transitional government. We'll see how it goes. But overwhelmingly right now, Congress is supportive of that aim. And the Trump administration, of course, is supportive of that aim. They view Sudan as a country that is moving in the right direction, that no longer sponsors terror, and that the U.S. should be sort of supporting them in the journey that they're undertaking right now. The Trump administration threw in the normalization thing during negotiations on this issue, as opposed to vice versa. But as far as Congress is concerned, the concern there is that if they don't legislate this immunity before the Biden administration comes in, it's not so much that the Biden administration would oppose it, it's sort of just that it would be very, very low priority issue. Sudan sort of threatened or said to Pompeo, we're going to stop the normalization with Israel if this doesn't pass through Congress by the end of 2020. Some of the experts I've spoken to in Sudan say that they don't think that'll actually happen because Israel actually helps them with their access to Washington and will advocate for them in Washington. And so, if they stop getting closer to Israel because of this, it's going to doubly hurt them. So it'll be interesting to see where that goes moving forward. And then the next thing is Morocco. Bahrain is not an issue here. The Bahrain wants a normalization with Israel, and there's not really strings attached, at least not that we know of at the moment. But Morocco, the normalization was tied up with U.S. recognition of Moroccan sovereignty in Western Sahara, which is also an extremely complicated issue that I'm not going to get into. But the U.S. is the only country in the world right now that recognizes that sovereignty, that recognizes that position. Now, that is an executive position. Congress doesn't have to authorize it or not authorize it. But there are also weapons sales to Morocco going on now, which the Trump administration has said is not tied to the normalization. But you never know moving forward. With the UAE, the F-35 sale wasn't technically tied to the Abraham Accords either. But as time moves forward, I mean, it's clear that Israel would have put up a much bigger fight when it comes to Israel's qualitative military edge had the UAE not normalized ties with Israel. So now with Morocco, it's not a matter of Israel's QME as much, but there could be concerns, especially if, God forbid, war breaks out in Western Sahara, which is a possibility that a lot of experts have said is possible now that, Morocco, if Morocco moves to sort of further exercise its sovereignty in the area, and that could threaten the normalization with Israel. So this is just overall these concerns about sort of strings being attached to these normalizations, and those strings sort of bring us back to Congress in many ways. So that is overall what I plan to say about Congress. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Lahav. And now we'll move on to Dan Mariaschin. He spent nearly all his professional life working on behalf of Jewish organization. It was ADL, AIPAC, and now he's the Chief Executive Officer of Bnai Brith International. Prior to joining Bnai Brith, Dan served as Director of Communications and Principal Spokesman for former Secretary Alexander Haig during his 1987-88 presidential campaign. And Dan I volunteered him to speak about American Jewry and the 2020 elections. Dan.
Yes, Efraim did volunteer me, so I will say at the outset that our organization, of course, is nonpartisan. So what you'll hear basically over the next number of minutes will be an analysis of the Jewish vote in this particular election year. Now, estimates of the Jewish vote in the presidential election vary, but clearly more Jews than not remain loyal to the Democratic Party, largely 2/3. 1/3, that's more or less been the percentages over the last number of years. In this particular election, the Associated Press in its survey said that 68% of Jews voted for Biden and 30% for Trump. There are differing numbers. Some say that it was 71 for Biden, 29, 28. Numbers are really all over the place, but let's work with the Associated Press numbers, at least for the time being, 68 and 30. This was an improvement for Trump over 2016 when he won 24% of the Jewish vote to Hillary Clinton's 71%. Now this year's breakdown was very similar, in fact, to the 2020 results, to the 2012 results, when Obama took about 69% of the Jewish vote and Mitt Romney 30%. And you'd have to go back to the presidential elections of 1916 and 1920 to see much higher numbers in terms of the Jewish vote on the Republican side. 1916 and 1920, the numbers were about 45 or 50% in those races for the Republicans. In fact, even if you go back to Eisenhower, he only received, he got 36% of the vote versus Adlai Stevenson I think in the second of his 2 terms, even though he was a very popular candidate. Ronald Reagan had about 39% in 1980. That was kind of the high water mark, at least in modern times, for Republican presidential candidates. Now, Jewish support for Biden was important, underscoring the importance of the Jewish vote in presidential elections, particularly in Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, and Michigan. Now, it's interesting, when we look back 35, 45, 50 years, the bulk of the Jewish population, of course, largely in the Northeast, some of it in Illinois, Ohio. Florida was just beginning to see large numbers of Jews in its population. And we used to say that in places like New Jersey, even Massachusetts, New York State, of course, and other states in the Northeast, Jews could kind of tip the election in any given presidential year. As Jews have moved to other places, and I've just mentioned Georgia and Arizona, for example, as they've moved to the Sun Belt, as the Florida Jewish population has grown exponentially, you start to see that now changing in terms of the impact that the Jewish vote can have in any given state in a presidential election. Professor Jonathan Sarna of Brandeis has cited a growth among, quote, bedrock Republican Jews since Lyndon Johnson carried 90% of the Jewish vote in 1964. And he attributes this to the increase in the number of Orthodox Jews, in addition to Russian, Latino, Iranian, and other Jewish immigrants who overall are more worried about the far left wing of the Democratic Party than the far right, according to Sarna. We have to remember that the Jewish community, which numbers somewhere between 5.5 and 6 million people in the United States, has a very wide band of senior citizens. We Jews as an ethnic group live longer. We have fewer children, and so that band of senior citizens is very large, and they make a difference in how Jews vote. Now, President Trump delivered on a number of initiatives that even many Jews who didn't vote for him do support, like recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital, new sanctions on Iran, and an executive order enhancing civil rights protections for Jews in schools and on campuses. And it remains to be seen, of course, and Dan has talked about this to a great extent, exactly what will happen in terms of all of those measures that the president took, either through executive orders or otherwise, is to see how much will remain. Certainly, we believe that the embassy will remain in Jerusalem, and there will be other things that will stay the same, and some will change, as you've heard in Dan's presentation. Now, President-elect Biden, who is perceived as a moderate or a mainstream Democrat, will have to deal with the progressive wing of his party. This includes people like Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, who was actually engaged in anti-Semitism by propagating stereotypes about money and power, dual loyalty, demonizing Israel with accusations just last month of ethnic cleansing, and Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib from Michigan, who has made many similar statements. It also includes people who might not be considered to be anti-Semitic, but who support BDS and conditioning US aid to Israel. And that is deeply problematic, would be problematic to the US-Israel bilateral relationship. Now, according to a September 2020 survey by the Jewish Electorate Institute, domestic issues such as the coronavirus, Medicare, Social Security, healthcare, the economy, climate change, and the rise of anti-Semitism are the top issues for the majority of Jewish voters. 64% of Jewish respondents cited the COVID response as one of the most important issues. Well, 56% cited Medicare and Social Security. I mentioned we're an older community, so those issues would be very important to them. 55% pointed to healthcare. All Americans are concerned about healthcare, but if you're older, you're more concerned about it. and 52% prioritized the economy and jobs as being important. Those surveyed indicated a greater trust in Biden than in Trump on all of these issues. Trump's highest mark in the trust category was on the economy and on jobs, where 33% of respondents said they trusted him more, compared to 58% for Biden. In the same survey, 42% of Jewish respondents to the survey indicated that anti-Semitism is one of the most important issues for them. Certainly, there has been a spike in anti-Semitism, and not only globally, but in this country as well. But this issue fell behind Supreme Court nominations, which rated 46%, and just behind anti-Semitism on the list was gun safety at 41%. Only 26% of those polled said they trusted the president more on anti-Semitism, compared to 60% for Biden. Now, this is important. A notably small percentage of respondents in this particular survey, just 25%, cited Israel as one of the most important issues for them. Now, this is something that our community is grappling with. We talk about BDS and we talk about global anti-Semitism, and these are tremendous challenges to us. But in our own community, question of where young people are, where the general Jewish community is on Israel, it becomes more stark when you look at this figure that just 25% of the respondents cited Israel as one of the most important issues to them. Now, there are reasons for that. It could be the new generation, which feels that Israel doesn't face existential threats, notwithstanding Iran. It could be that people feel Israel is strong, that it can defend itself. Those of us who are older remember another time, and so we look at this through a different lens. Now, this is not to suggest that those polled don't support Israel. 87% of both Democrats and Republicans, at exactly the same number, describe themselves as generally pro-Israel. Although some of them were supportive of the Israeli government at present and critical of the Israeli government. It was only a generation or two ago where American Jews were not digging deep or drilling deeply into which Israeli government was in power. It was a matter of being supportive of Israel, irrespective of the government in power. And today, more and more people are lining up behind this party or that candidate or that prime minister. And so we have a different way of looking at Israel, at least from American Jewry, than we did before. An AMI magazine survey prior to the election found that 83% of Orthodox Jews said they would vote for Trump, compared to just 13% for Biden. 4% were undecided. 76% of the poll respondents said that they believe the media is unfair to Trump. Another AMI magazine poll in 2019 found that 89% of Orthodox Jews approved of Trump's performance as president. And according to the magazine, America's Orthodox population is divided. You have the Haredi population, modern Orthodox, 14% other, etc. The traditional inclination of Jews to vote for Democrats is based on social minority status, liberal religious and political views, and their support for church-state separation. Jewish conservatives, who are growing in number, have received less attention. And many Orthodox Jews who voted for Trump on the personal chemistry issue, sometimes it rated higher, sometimes it rated lower, but they respect his policies as opposed to liberal democratic policies. So conservative policies Orthodox Jews would favor, for example, would include religious liberties for public menorah lightings, or tax credits, tuition tax credits for religious schools. Also important to Orthodox Jews are conservative Supreme Court nominations, and again, Trump's policies toward Israel, particularly the move of the embassy to Jerusalem. Orthodox voters also expressed unease over the civil unrest that we have been grappling with over the past number of months. I want to just close with some comments and observations on Congress. In his 1974 book, important book, if you look back at it, Jews in American Politics, Stephen Isaacs, who then wrote for the Washington Post, observed that Jews seemed reticent to run for elective office at the national level, citing various concerns, including anti-Semitism, that could hinder their campaigns. In interviews with a number of Jews prominent in electoral politics, he noted that some Jews held important posts as strategic and media consultants or in fundraising, but not necessarily as candidates. Indeed, in 1974, there were only about a dozen Jewish members of the House of Representatives, with more than half coming from New York City in the New York area, and only 3 in the Senate, Jacob Javits and Abe Ribicoff, and one was filling a vacancy, Howard Metzenbaum of Ohio, who was later elected in his own right. And not after that long, after that was published in 1974, things did begin to change, with Jewish members in both the House and Senate increasing. And the high points actually were over 30 in the House and 13 in the Senate not that long ago, representing states not only with traditionally large Jewish populations, but also from New Hampshire, Oregon, Kansas, Nevada, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Hawaii, and Nebraska. So indeed, things are changing. So let's look at the 117th Congress. It will include 25 Jewish House members, all but 2 of whom, David Kutzoff of Tennessee and Lee Zeldin of New York, are Democrats. And the Senate will hold steady at about 9 Jewish members, all Democrats, or increase to 10, depending on what happens in the John Ossoff race in Georgia. 2 prominent, it's been noted also by Lahav, 2 prominent Jewish members of Congress will be leaving office this month. House Appropriations Committee Chairwoman Nita Lowey is retiring, while Foreign Affairs Chairman Elliot Engel, as was mentioned, a great friend of Israel, a great friend of the Jewish community, lost a primary race to progressive Jamal Bowman. Freshman Democrat Max Rose of Staten Island lost to a Republican Nicole Maliotakis, and Democrat Kathy Manning, who many of you know, of North Carolina, a former head of Jewish Federations of North America, will take a seat in Congress for the first time next month. So that's the overview of Jews and the 2020 elections. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. We'll move now to the second panel, which will deal with the main issues on the agenda. I think that our friend Professor Kairidis is not on board. So we'll move to General Amidror. Oh, Kairidis, Dimitri, good to see you.
Hi.
Last moment. Okay, good. Happy to see you. I'm happy to introduce Dimitri Kairidis. He's currently a member of Hellenic Parliament, but he has a rich academic career. He taught until recently at Pantheon University of Athens. He was a senior fellow of Konstantinos Karamanlis Foundation, deputy director of the Institute of International Relations in Athens. He has done many other things. He's also was a consultant to the Greek Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He was a Karamanlis professor at Tufts University and director of the Kokalis Foundation at Harvard. This is where I believe I met you first time. So Dimitri, you are welcome to speak to us about the US and the East Mediterranean.
Thank you very much, Efraim. It's great to be with you, and I hope I was on time and not late or anything, but it's a crazy season now, just before Christmas here in Athens with the parliament and everything up working. My most important claim to fame is obviously that I have been a co-conspirator with my friend Efraim for many years, and we have preceded the Greek-Israeli strategic partnership by some years, by some decades, I would say. We had been there before Jerusalem and Athens came closer together the last 10 years. And I'm very proud of that relationship and of our achievement. Thank you very much. I'm also chairman of the Greek-Israeli Friendship Committee at the Greek Parliament, and in that capacity, I'm in close contact both with your ambassador here, a very dynamic Israeli diplomat, and with Knesset in Jerusalem. We had a very good session the other day. We have a few problems with the fact that just about when you have elections, you have new elections in Israel. And so there is a constant rotation of new members in the Knesset, and we never know if we will work together with the current ones. And I hear that there is a possibility for a fourth election soon. But I guess this is the beauty of the Israeli political system. And we work together. Now, this is very important. And for us, Israel has come top of the agenda. And we look very much forward to further strengthening the relationship, both strategic, economic, cultural, and social. Athens, until recently, was full of Israeli guests and visitors who came here before our lockdown, and it shows how close the two people have come together. Now, my topic is obviously the United States, that has given us many news the last few weeks, including the elections and recently the sanctioning of Turkey. Let me start with the elections in Greece. Just like in the rest of Europe, the election of Biden was welcomed. There is no doubt about that. Trump was considered both anti-European in the sense that he didn't have much sympathy for European integration, and he had said so. He had welcomed and cheered for Brexit and any Eurosceptic movement in the fringes of Europe. And he was quite detrimental to the unity and cohesion of NATO. Not that everything he said was wrong, but at least the way he said it did kind of annoy, to say the least, the European mainstream. And thirdly, he was also very supportive of all these anti-liberal populist forces that had gathered strength because of the economic crisis in the periphery of Europe, in places like Hungary and Poland. So Trump is out, and Europe, especially the European liberal mainstream, has been happy about that change and look forward to a re-strengthening of NATO, of the Euro-Atlantic partnership, and a return to some kind of normalcy in the Euro-American relationship. Now, Biden is a guy that is very experienced, obviously from his years in the Senate and later in the vice presidency. He knows the area very, very well. He has visited Greece and Cyprus and all the other countries, obviously Israel, all these previous years. He's institutionalist, so he follows the more closely the guidance of the American bureaucracy, of the State Department and the Defense, and he's an internationalist. He's not the America First nationalist. This is the primary reading of him. We will see how he will evolve. Now, Pompeo, out of nowhere, decided to make a gift to all of us just when he was about to leave. He obviously wanted to move tough on Turkey for quite some time. Trump did not let him. There was this special relationship between Trump and Erdogan. There was a vote in the Congress, as you know, but he did not wait for the ratification of the defense budget. He moved preemptively on his own, based on this large majority for sanctioning Turkey in both houses of Congress, in the Senate, in the House of Representatives, and he imposed some tough sanctions on Turkey's defense industry, surprising Erdogan, unsettling the Turkish regime. These are sanctions that do not have only an immediate economic and technological impact on Turkey, but have a broader political connotation. obviously. And the debate on sanctioning further Turkey is not over in the US Congress. For those of us who follow American politics closely, we know that there is more discussion going on from the Armenian lobby in regard to what happened in Nagorno-Karabakh with Halkbank, the famous state bank controlled by Erdogan and his entourage that broke the Iranian sanctions, and so on and so forth. And in addition, America gave a signal to the Europeans in their perennial procrastination and hesitation have been debating for over 6 months now to do something about Turkey. Europe is obviously very divided between a majority that wants to move further and a minority, a strong minority though, led by Germany, that views Turkey favorably, in particular because of its handling and help to handle the refugee crisis. And so the Europeans in their last meeting decided to follow America's lead. Unashamedly, they put this into the conclusions of the European Council. Let's wait and see what the Americans will do. The Americans spoke, and now the Europeans will have to follow suit, at least in NATO, where suddenly the General Secretary, Stoltenberg, who was equidistant so far, has started saying a few negative things about Turkey as soon as the Americans moved. And the rest of the Europeans, especially the Germans, will have to somehow, in the next few weeks, follow suit. Now, obviously, in the Eastern Mediterranean, there is a complicated environment in which the new American administration will move in. There is a left wing in the Democratic Party, as you know, that is very sensitive on matters of human rights and democracy, and views al-Sisi and the Saudis very negatively. There is an environmental fringe that also thinks of the East Med and all these energy projects as anti-environmental. There are the old Clintonistas who have learned nothing of the past, and they are like the Bourbons, you know, the royal family of France, which was restored to power after the French Revolution, and famously was said they learned nothing, they regretted nothing, and they are the same. Madeleine Albright, they suddenly rediscovered Madeleine in Washington, and she's ready to offer her advice. And it will be interesting how Biden will manage to work together all these various constituencies within the Democratic Party. I think there will be some return, but not full return, to what we knew before. Turkey is trying to find a way to some understanding with the Israelis. I know that they are sending a new ambassador now after 2 years in Tel Aviv, a Turk who speaks Hebrew and studied in Jerusalem. They are trying very hard to make amends with the Egyptians. Obviously, the Egyptian-Turkish cleavage was fundamental after the ousting of the Muslim Brothers in 2013 for the architecture that emerged in the Eastern Mediterranean. There are the Europeans who are trying to do something and always fail, with the French at the forefront and the rest not exactly knowing what to do. The Europeans were totally humiliated in Nagorno-Karabakh, France in particular, and the Americans, because they were not included in the final settlement. It was a Turkish-Russian affair. So it is a very interesting new beginning starting on January 20th. in our region, with Erdogan trying to lower his tone. It's not easy for him. He has not been accustomed to make amends. He's trying to play it soft in anticipation of the new US administration. He knows that he is hard-pressed, both economically, domestically, his popularity, and externally because of the overextension of Turkey in various fronts. And we will see what will happen with the Americans in this part of the world. There is this idea of a multilateral meeting that the Turks first propagated and the Europeans, Charles Michel, took over. Obviously, the problem is Turkey's non-recognition of the Republic of Cyprus in such a multilateral endeavor, and the fact that Turkey has some very unique opinions about the exclusive economic zone, and an attitude that if not all pipelines do not cross Turkey itself, it is being excluded. I mean, it wants either all the pipelines to go through Turkey the way they do today, and if just one of them, many, circumvents Turkey, it cries fool and that it is being excluded. So we are very much looking forward to what is happening. There is an interesting tension between transactionalism and values and principles, and that one needs to balance when it deals with this part of the world. There is also China, which is very interesting, and this is something the Americans, for the Americans, is very important, and will force a certain choice on their European allies vis-a-vis China. And I conclude, I don't know, in Israel, what immunization are you choosing? I'm not fully aware, because, as you know, in Europe, we went the American way, Pfizer and Moderna.
The same. The same.
There is an interesting geostrategy of immunization. In Turkey, they went for the Chinese. Personally, I would rather go for Pfizer and Moderna rather than Sputnik or the Chinese, but it shows you that in all sorts of ways, Turkey is looking towards Asia and away from the West, including the immunization program that is starting as of a week from today, next week. Thank you, Efraim.
Thank you, Dimitri, for joining us. I know you have a very pressed schedule. I just want to mention that Dimitri is also a member of the Hellenic Forum, which brings together scholars, journalists, and politicians from Greece, Cyprus, and Israel, and all this is under the sponsorship of Bnai Brith, that is a co-sponsor of this event. Now we'll move on to General Yaakov Amidror.
I have the greatest admiration and respect for Professor Inbar. I want to say this out loud. I have been impressed by the energy, the commitment, he is always there. And as the years go by, he's becoming better and better. And I truly admire, and I have the greatest respect. Bravo, Efraim, for your work and for being there and for the clarity of your arguments, which is often lost among academics. And it's very helpful for us now as politicians, I speak. Thank you.
I'll put you in touch with my wife, Dimitri. Now we'll move to General Amidror. He's a Greg and Anne Rosshandler Senior Fellow at JISS. General Amidror was National Security Advisor to Prime Minister Netanyahu and chairman of the National Security Council 2011-2013. He served for 36 years in senior IDF posts, including commander of the military colleges, military secretary to the Ministry of Defense, director of the Intelligence Analysis Division in Military Intelligence, and he is currently also a distinguished fellow at the JISSThe Gemunder Center. And General Amidror will speak about the Iranian challenge. Amidror.
Thank you very much. After the compliments that you got from the other side of the Mediterranean, it's not so easy to speak, but I'll try. You know, why there is such a problem between us and the United States of America relating to Iran? And I'm going now to say the obvious, but it should be emphasized again and again. The difference came from two perspectives. For Israel, the issue of Iran is a very close threat, physically, geographically, and it is about the destruction of the state of Israel. So the issue is dramatically important for the state of Israel, critical for its existence. For the United States of America, as Ambassador Shapiro said 2 hours ago, it is another problem. Not in tier 1, relating to China, Russia, and so on. Maybe not even in tier 2. So with all these differences, how we are judging the threat and how the Americans are judging the threat, it's not surprising that we have such a big gap. For Israel, it is the threat to its existence. For America, it's another threat. There are many. Local, regional, not critical. With the new administration, we might have another problem, which is coming from the fact that it is the symbol of destroying the legacy of Trump and going back to President Obama legacy. I'm not sure that the next administration will go in every area to the same line which had been taken by the previous administration, by Obama administration. As far as I remember, the elected president say it is not going to be the third term of Obama, but when it is coming to Iran, it's like the attitude of the Trump administration towards the healthcare. It is more about emotions than logic. Even Tom Friedman thinks that the new administration should take the advantage of the pressure which had been, which is so strong on Iran based on the decisions of the previous administration, and not neglect it and giving it back to the previous situation. And I think that in this case, it is very rare, I agree with Tom Friedman. It will be a huge mistake not to use this leverage which had been built by previous administration only because it was built by Trump administration. It's, as I said, it's very it's like the attitude towards healthcare in the United States by the Trump administration. So these are the two reasons why there is a gap between Washington and Jerusalem relating to Iran. I think that the new administration might be an opportunity if it will be wise. Why? The Iranians build their policy on the assumption that at the end of the day, after 4 years, the Obama people will come back and they can go back to stage one and having the bad agreement again. For them, it's a very good agreement. The agreement from 2015, and they just have to wait. And if they will be stubborn enough and wait enough, they will overcome. If this administration, when it is coming in, will make it clear to the Iranians that is not going back to square one, that when he is speaking about longer and stronger agreement, he meant it, they will have to reconsider their policy. And this is an opportunity, because the whole stubbornness of the Iranians was built on the assumption that in 2021, January 2021, it's the end of the problem from the Iranian point of view. If that will be well understood in Tehran, that it is not going to be ended, but by having a stronger and longer agreement, this might be, it might succeed. If, but in the contrary, the new administration will lift the sanctions, will say publicly, let's go back to the old agreement. And then we will negotiate a new one, taking care to all the problems that were loopholes in the old agreement. No chance. I'm speaking from experience of 25 years with the issue. In 1995, I was the head of the assessment branch of the military intelligence. We found the first steps of the Iranians towards nuclear military capability. We applied to the Americans. They nominated a committee headed by a very important ambassador. And after 2 months, they came back to us and said, guys, nothing was found. We killed the old threat of Saddam Hussein, and you are innovating a new one which does not exist. It took the state of Israel another 2 years to convince the Americans that the Iranians are serious about their nuclear military capability. We didn't know how serious. Only after we found the archive in Tehran and brought it to Tel Aviv, we understood how serious the Iranians were. But when we came to the Americans, 95, they came back and said, nothing is happening in Tehran. They are going to make the same mistake. They think that they will give the Iranians back the bad agreement of 2015, and the Iranians will be ready somehow to negotiate about longer and stronger agreement. It will not happen. The only way to achieve the need that the Americans are saying that this is their policy, a longer and stronger agreement, is to go by 2 stages. One is to prevent the negative, sur mera in Hebrew, not to make the mistake in lifting the sanctions, but to say to the Iranians, guys, we want to negotiate with you. You have to come to negotiate. We want a longer and stronger agreement. And you have to understand, if you don't come to negotiate, you have a lot to lose, because we will continue the same sanctions that you are facing now and even make them stronger in the future. Then to go to negotiate about something which will be better than the bad agreement of 2015. And if they will go back and they succeed to bring the Iranians into the negotiating table. And I remember when all the experts in the United States of America and outside the United States of America called us, the Iranians will not negotiate about their nuclear project. And we said, put sanctions on them, And if they will see that it is either negotiating or losing the ability to control Iran, they will negotiate. And thanks to the American pressure and a lot of efforts by the American institutions of agencies of the administration, they had been brought into the table. The fact that the negotiators from the American side failed in the negotiation is not connected to the fact that America succeeded to bring the Iranians into the negotiation table. No question that in negotiation themselves, the Iranians were much better negotiators than the Americans. Why? Another question. What was the mistake? It's a very good question to answer. But this is the only way to bring the Iranians. Why I'm saying it in so convincing, I'm very convinced that this is the only way, because it happened in the future, and I have the experience of the story of the past. I have the experience of the past. How so it happened after the Americans decided to bring the Iranians on their knees and to bring them to negotiate. And many experts, as I said, in Israel and in America said, never. The Iranians will not negotiate on the project. When it will come to negotiations, you have to understand and to make us understand what it is means stronger and longer. Longer is it's easy, 50 years for eternity, not 10 years, which is long for terms of president or prime minister, but it's a very short in history of a state. What should be done? We have to go to the loopholes of the previous one. For example, to prevent R&D, and Ambassador Shapiro spoke about the capability, the new capabilities and the new situation of the Iranians. Of course, according to the agreement, they could make all the R&D and to implement much better centrifuges than they had before the agreement. That was part of the agreement. They didn't violate the agreement. They make all the research and all the R&D, and they succeeded to build a new and much better centrifuges without violating the agreement. It was part of the agreement. The agreement didn't say anything about the missiles. The agreement was very bad about the whole issue of weaponization. What happened is the Americans changed their policy from dismantling the Iranians' capabilities to postpone and monitor the capabilities. But the postponement was very short, 10 years, and the monitor was very bad. In reality, more loopholes than real monitoring system. If you have to tell the Iranians, I don't know, 3 months in advance that you are going somewhere and they can say yes or no, it's not real monitoring. By the way, the Iranians didn't give the answers to the question which had been asked by the organization in Vienna up till now, and we don't know the truth about places which had been monitored by the organization, and the Iranians didn't answer what happened there, and they found very important issues to answer, materials that should not be there, and if they had been there, it means that the Iranians are still cheating. And I hope that this time, unlike the previous one, as was mentioned, the administration will not lie to Israel. They didn't lie only to Israel. They lied to those who supposed to lie to Israel, that the Israelis will not find the truth about the negotiations. And I hope that this time they will use the capabilities that Israel has, the intelligence that Israel has, the know-how that Israel has relating to non-proliferation and proliferation systems. And instead of flying to Israel, they will take the capability of Israel and use it in the negotiation, something that they were not ready to do in the previous administration, because they didn't want to tell Israel the truth. So if I have to conclude what I think should be done relating to Iran, first is to keep the sanctions. It will help the Americans to negotiate. Second, such negotiations should be well prepared and to understand what does it mean longer and stronger. And I'm quoting the American. Third, in Israel, there is a lot of knowledge about Iran and how to prevent the Iranians from cheating and lying during the time of the fulfilling of the agreement. And fourth, which is not relating just to nuclear, Iran is the most destructive force in the Middle East, the most aggressive one. I agree that Turkey is moving a lot of efforts to compete with the Iranians. But still, Iran, because of its proxy forces in Lebanon, in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq, is still the most destructive one. Maybe one day it will change, but today, even more destructive than Turkey. It is very important that the Americans will put red lines, American red lines. We cannot tell the Americans where to put red lines. It's American policy. By the way, by putting red lines to the Iranians, it will make America stronger in the Middle East, and it will make very clear message to Turkey not to cross red lines that had been put by the United States of America. And it will be very helpful, not just relating to Iran, but also relating to the aggressiveness of Turkey. For Israel, it is very important that the United States of America will come strong again around the world and in the Middle East, because as an ally of the United States of America, for us, it's a better situation if America is accepted as a strong force in our area and around the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, General Amidror. Now we'll move on to Colonel retired Dr. Eran Lerman. He's the Vice President of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security. Dr. Lerman was Deputy Director for Foreign Policy and International Affairs at the National Security Council. He worked under Amidror, his deputy served. He held senior posts in the IDF military intelligence for over 20 years. He also served for 8 years as director of the Israel and Middle East Office of the American Jewish Committee. He nowadays also teaches at the Shalem College in Jerusalem in the postgraduate programs at Tel Aviv University. He holds a PhD from the London School of Economics, and he will speak to us about the challenges on the US-Israeli agenda. Eran?
Fine, thank you. And may I second what everything that Dimitris has just been saying. I think to have this international gathering at this time is really of great value. I cannot add much to what Amidror has already discussed, and certainly the question of Iran is going to be uppermost on the Israeli-American agenda from the 21st of January onwards. The Biden administration will face a decision, a major decision. We just need to remember that even within the Obama administration, there were divergences. There were people who upheld some of the sanction system against Iran, even while the Kerry negotiators got, forgive the pun, carried away with the attempt to mollify the Iranians and cut a deal. There were others in the Treasury, for example, who stood guard against the erosion of the sanctions on some aspects like Hezbollah activities, etc. So I look forward to what is going to be, I think, a very profound discussion with the administration on this. And I would say two things in a more general sense. First of all, I believe that it is important for Israel to realize, I think, that this is a modern administration in the old sense. We've just had two postmodern administrations that left behind the depth of historical commitment to the 1945 dispensation. This administration looks as if it is going to restore some of this, and people tend to forget the cracks appeared already under Obama, let alone under the erratic nature of the Trump administration. But Biden, and I would say Biden, Blinken, Sullivan are traditionalists in this sense. And I believe that rebuilding the transatlantic relationship paradoxically may actually, contrary to the historical Israeli instincts that, the Europeans spell trouble, here there may be opportunities. Blinken is very French in his own way, and raised, by the way, by a Holocaust survivor in France. A famous one who wrote a book about his experiences. And he may be instrumental in building bridges to Europe through actually more, possibly through Paris, where there will be an element of continuity, than through Berlin, where we are looking in the relatively short period ahead at the possibility of a change of government, of leadership. And France has repositioned itself, and this connects with what we've heard about the Eastern Mediterranean in a rather remarkable way over the last few months. It's coming on board on the EMGF. It's coming on board on the question of countering Erdogan's ambitions. It is by now, I would say, part of an alignment of forces that stretches from Paris to Abu Dhabi and back by way of Jerusalem and Cairo and Athens and Lefkosia. So it's an interesting new departure, which could have implications not only for the Eastern Mediterranean, but also for the Gulf question, because once this is an element in defining priorities, we need to bear in mind, not only the Gulf players, but also France have been very adamant on the Iranian question during the Obama. France was the most, I would say, strict negotiator of the six in the G5+1 or E3+3 negotiations with Iran. So we may find ourselves for the first time in our long history actually looking forward to a greater degree of transatlantic cooperation. Moreover, for us, in a more general sense, responding to the first part of this evening, to what we've heard from Ms. Harkov and from Bob Lieber and others, this may be an opportunity for Israel. And General Amidror said as much in the Iranian context. I think we were in danger of being turned in all aspects of Israeli policy, from Iran to the Palestinian question, maybe even the Eastern Mediterranean, into a partisan proposition. Even the Abrahamic agreements stood in danger of becoming a partisan issue in the atmosphere generated in the last 4 years. I think that the Biden administration, with its basic instincts, will find it easier to isolate and marginalize the radical elements, the squad, etc., and bring us back to the point of equilibrium of bipartisanship. But I would also say that this requires Israel to relearn some of the arts that have begun to atrophy, of speaking across the spectrum of American politics, not just relying on an extremely friendly and responsive administration, speaking to Congress, speaking to the administration at various levels. And I should also add, and this is, I think, a very significant issue, speaking to the establishment, the defense establishment. I wouldn't dare use the term deep state at this point, but to the defense establishment and the intelligence establishment, for whom Israel has become a much more significant asset in recent years across a full spectrum of issues, from cyber to counter-terrorist tactics, in a way that will enhance our common perspectives. And as was rightly said here, this is an administration that would listen to the professionals. And we now have an opportunity to speak systemically to the professionals. The reason I raise this is because beyond Iran, I believe that perhaps the greatest challenge we may face, and Professor Kairidis has already mentioned this, may be the attitude towards Egypt and Saudi Arabia. The Emiratis raise less hackles, but human rights issues, which are so central to the democratic agenda, may become, if they become more than an irritant, if they become a major disruptive element in the discussion about Egyptian and Saudi stability, then it will be necessary for Israel to actually play a role in a debate which we once shied away from. And that will be a challenge, but it will also have the benefit of making us ever more important to our new Arab friends in the strategic alignment. We are now coming to the paradoxical situation where Turkey and Pakistan speak to us because they understand that this will ameliorate their position in Riyadh. The road to Riyadh goes through Jerusalem. That's new. The question is, how would this be affected by a problematic atmosphere in Washington vis-a-vis MBS and vis-a-vis Abdel Fattah al-Sisi? That will contain the elements of both a challenge for us, but also, as I said, an opportunity. On the Palestinian question, clearly we need to relearn language that we knew how to use in the past, and Efraim and myself have written an essay to that effect. We need to speak to the incoming democratic administration and to our democratic friends in Congress in terms of our willingness to re-engage if and when the Palestinians shed off, as they now have to really, the delusion of an imposed solution. We can even try to move in a bipartisan way to basically rule out the possibility of an imposed solution, to solidify the insight that has already, I would say, made itself manifest to the Palestinian leadership by way of Israeli-American interactions as well as the current Israeli-Arab interactions. And if we do this effectively, I believe that we can at least lay the foundations for what could be a structure for negotiations, bearing in mind that we may face a transition also on the Palestinian side. But we need to persuade the Biden team, the Democratic leadership, as well as our friends on the other side of the aisle in Washington, that we are willing to engage. But the terms of this engagement cannot be what I call the EKP, the everybody knows paradigm that would basically roll us back to the ideas that President Obama put on the table in May 2011 and went absolutely nowhere. We need to basically build upon what is positive in the Trump legacy, in the Peace to Prosperity plan of January 2020. In other words, I think that ultimately our challenge would be to help, for once, an incoming American administration move beyond the what we saw as the ABB and ABC and ABO of the recent changes of government. That's to say anything but Bush, anything but Clinton, anything but Obama as a driver of policy. If we fall into the, once again, into the pitfalls of an ABT, anything but Trump, and things that were actually positive will end up being thrown overboard, that will be a pity. And to avoid this, my last point is, I think it should be Israel's strategy to work once again very closely with the key organizations of American Jewry. Again, this is atrophied to some extent, because when you have full access, easy access to the very core of the White House, you may feel that you're no longer obliged to walk the path with your old friends who are no longer necessary. But we should go back there. I'm saying this not only because of my history as a representative of one of these organizations and being now co-sponsored by another, but because I think this will be a very good re-education for our leadership. Whether we have a change of leadership or not in the next year is in the hands of well, whoever negotiates the current government crisis. But regardless, we need to go back to these basics in an effective way. And if we do so, I think we really can confidently look to the Biden era as Biden-Harris era as an opportunity. Thank you.